Okay, everyone. I think we'll get started. Thank you all for coming tonight. Good evening. I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, land that was never ceded. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us tonight. We're here today, this evening, to hear a lecture on Australia's refugee policy, leading the world backwards. And our speaker tonight will be known to many of you who've been involved with the campaign. If you don't know him, he is Dr. John Minns. He's a lecturer at the ANU and a stalwart of this campaign for a fairer refugee policy. So I guess without any further ado, make him welcome. Thanks.
Well, friends, thanks very much for being here tonight. And I think it's the case that many Australians like to think that on many questions we lead the world, or we're at the top of the world, or we're better than the average, at least, in the world. And over the last couple of years in particular, what we've seen is a bunch of our leading politicians finding another first for Australia, another leading role. Increasingly over the last 2 years, our political leaders, our government leaders in particular, have been arguing that our refugee policy is the best in the world. In fact, it's become a recurrent theme since Tony Abbott made this speech in London at the Margaret Thatcher Society in October 2015, where he said, although it's going to gnaw at our consciences, the only way that Europe can deal with this tide of humanity surging through Europe and possibly changing it forever is by adopting the Australian solution. And a recurring theme it became. So last year, Malcolm Turnbull took it up as well. If others wish to emulate what we've done, they should. And Scott Morrison did the same thing. The way in which we control our borders, apparently, according to Morrison, is the envy of the world. It is the kind of border control that the rest of the world would like to have. And the rest of the world is catching up to Australia. And to a certain extent, and looked at in a certain way, this is partly true. Because we did indeed establish the harshest measures against refugees and asylum seekers before anyone else in the world. In 1992, of course, as many of you know, we adopted mandatory detention of asylum seekers who arrived without a visa. This is the first time that this happened anywhere in the world, to my knowledge, certainly since the 1951 Convention on Refugees, since the Second World War, basically. We were the first place to do that. And we had a 273-day limit on that detention, quite a long limit. You could be kept in detention for nearly a year. But the following year, in 1993, we removed that limit as well. So now you can be kept in detention indefinitely. And still today, there is nowhere in the world that has that system. To give you an idea, and I'm going to be talking quite a lot about Poland, about Europe tonight, Poland has probably got the harshest attitude towards refugees in Europe. It's not taking any from the Middle East or from North Africa. It's not taking any Muslim migrants, and it's built the whole politics of the ruling party has been built on that kind of hatred. Poland is only now considering establishing detention centres in Poland for people who arrive without a visa. Only now. And it's proposing that the limit on detention be 28 days. So we are indeed leading the world in this sense. And we, of course, led the world again in 2001 after the Tampa incident when John Howard began offshore detention on Manus Island and Nauru. From then until 2007 and again from 2012 to today. Now, while there are a few echoes of that happening in Europe today, the deal between the European Union and Turkey has a few things in common with that. There are no offshore detention centres which are paid for by European countries or by any other countries elsewhere in the developing world. So yes, in that sense, we are leading the world. And there is nowhere in the world, to my knowledge, that says, as Kevin Rudd did in July 2013, that if you attempted to come without a visa, you would never set foot in the country ever again, even on a tourist visa or a business class visa or anything else if you were settled in another country. Europe doesn't have that, even today. And in Europe, there are many now far-right groups that have looked at the Australian policy and looked at it favourably. So the first to react to Abbott's speech with praise was Nigel Farage, who was the then leader of UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, a far-right party, which made not only getting out of the European Union, but made border control its central plank, a far-right party, with the infamous banner that was driving around during the last election campaign in the UK. He thought, what the Australians are doing is exactly what the European Union should be doing. The far-right party of Denmark, the Denmark People's Party, says that this is exactly the sort of thing in offshore detention that the European Union should be doing, and they suggested Morocco as the kind of place that could be Europe's Manus Island or Nauru. If we pay them enough, they'll do the sorts of things that the Australians are doing now. That, by the way, says, I don't know if anyone here speaks Danish, do you? But I'm pretty sure that says, adopt the customs or leave the country. A very anti-Islamic kind of organisation, very praiseworthy of Australia's policy. And the Dutch VVD party, which is a far-right party as well, which is again made attacking Muslims and border control and migrants, opposing migration, a centrepiece of its policy, also says, it actually says the Australian solution shouldn't treat them all that well, which is what the Australians do. That's the Australian solution. And that poster says, in Rotterdam, we speak Dutch. Very often, what we do in this campaign is we talk about the effect of, quite rightly, we talk about the effect of Australia's refugee policy on the refugees and the people seeking asylum who come to us. And we deal with the terrible damage that's being done to those people as we speak at this very moment. And it's right that we do that. But what I'd like to do in this meeting tonight is to step back from that question a little, to step back from it and look at the broader ramifications in politics for our own societies based on that, having that kind of refugee policy. And I think there are three areas in which the refugee policy that we have and harsh refugee policies elsewhere in the world have an impact on our society and change the way we are. They don't just affect the refugees, they affect us. The three areas I'm going to talk about are the effects on people's thinking about immigration and immigrants more generally, on multiculturalism, and on attitudes to Muslims. And I started thinking about this after reading an essay that had long been forgotten by one of the most powerful thinkers of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt, who was a Jew in Austria, fled Austria during the war, and in 1943 wrote this essay called We Refugees. And one of the things she says in that essay, she's talking obviously about Jewish refugees, of whom she was one, but one of the things that she says in this essay is that European peoples went to pieces. The society of Europe went to pieces because it allowed its weakest member to be excluded and persecuted. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. There is, as well, I think it's important to understand, a new argument being advanced by the supporters of our current refugee policy. The old argument, the central argument, was that if we didn't have these policies, people would get on boats and would drown at sea. And this was an argument that was clearly aimed at people with a conscience, clearly aimed at people who could empathise with refugees. It wasn't aimed at the people who said, sink the boats, send them all back, people who were ungenerous and mean-spirited. It was aimed at ordinary people who had doubts about the problem of people getting on boats. But that has started not to resonate anymore because there aren't so many boats. There aren't so many drownings, at least coming to Australia, trying to get to Australia. So the new argument that I think has been advanced, particularly over about the last year and a half, is that these policies, harsh policies, are actually the kinds of policies that bolster support for an immigration program in Australia, support for multiculturalism as well. And this is a point that is made now everywhere. If you look at Malcolm Turnbull's website, Prime Minister and Cabinet website, immigration website, and you look at many of their public comments, they're saying it everywhere. Malcolm Turnbull went to the United Nations in 2016 and argued this. Addressing this question, stopping the boats, in other words, through secure borders, has been essential in creating confidence. Strong borders are the foundation of our high immigration multicultural success. And without such policies, the argument goes, what we would have are racist and xenophobic policies. What we would have is Pauline Hanson. What we would have are the politics of Hansonism. So in this new argument, this new narrative that's been created, the government is there bravely standing against the tide of xenophobia and racism by taking control of the borders, and a critical part of that is turning back the boats, having Manus and Nauru, having mandatory detention, etc., having permanent exclusion. So they are the defenders now in this framework of multiculturalism and of immigration. Now, even before we get into broader questions of looking at this argument and how it works out, it's clearly incredibly hypocritical in that they themselves have made intervention after intervention which goes well across the line of attacking refugees and actually moves into attacking either non-English speaking migrants or people of colour or Muslim migrants in Australia on many, many occasions. Peter Dutton in 2016 said that Malcolm Fraser made a mistake in allowing Lebanese Muslims into the country back after the Lebanese Civil War in 1976. He did this on the basis, the evidence for this was that 22 Lebanese Muslims out of the thousands and thousands had been arrested on terrorism-related charges, 22. He didn't need to make this intervention, but clearly it was an intervention that was aimed at an audience who were already racist or already anti-Islamic. 2016 as well. He said illiterate and innumerate refugees would take Australian jobs or languish on the dole and on Medicare. This is the language of people who say that immigration takes your jobs, immigration takes our taxes, immigration is a problem for the country as a whole. Even Alan Tudge, just last month, argued that what we need are tougher English language tests for potential migrants. He's not talking about refugees or asylum seekers. He's saying migrants must have a higher standard of English. Now, it's kind of odd because all of these figures say, and they say over and over again, ad nauseum, that Australia is the most successful multicultural country in the world. Well, we had an English language test now for a long, long time being administered, creating this most successful multicultural society. Now we've got to have an even tougher English language test. And he said, he came very close to saying really what Pauline Hanson said in her maiden speech back in 1996, that Asian migrants form ghettos and do not assimilate and do not learn English. He came very close to saying that this is the case. Again, suddenly, we've got to be more suspicious and we've got to raise the borders, even if they're not physical borders, but the borders of an English language test. And last year, last April, Dutton introduced a bill to require permanent residents to wait 4 years instead of 1 to apply for citizenship. The idea here is that we've got to be suspicious about these people. The barriers to getting into Australia, and if you're in Australia already, the barriers to staying in Australia have to be raised because otherwise we're in danger. Otherwise we're under threat. And of course, again, Dutton's January comments, and Turnbull as well, in fact they did it jointly, about the South Sudanese gangs in Melbourne. They had absolutely no reason to make these comments because they're not responsible for policing in Victoria at all. And in fact, crime in Victoria in the year to last September went down 7%. And yet they both came out talking about South Sudanese gangs. What they're doing, I think, is continually going to the line and crossing the line sometimes, even in their own circles, even in terms of what their own circles will agree to and support. What they're doing constantly is trying to find new audiences, new eddies that they can tap for potential political support on the basis of xenophobic and racist sentiments. And we must be suspicious. We must be guarded against migrants, and not all migrants, by the way, not all migrants. South African farmers would be very, very good migrants. They would be exactly the sort of people that we want to see in the country, which of course suggests that others aren't quite as good. Again, I'm reminded of this essay by Hannah Arendt, because she's talking as well in this essay about Jewish people having fled their home and what they leave behind, all the things that they lose in the process of leaving. And actually, this can apply to economic migrants as well as refugees, that they lose familiarity of daily life, occupation, very often qualifications not being recognised in Australia, language, which means the naturalness of reactions, unaffected expression of feelings, relatives, etc., the rupture of our private lives. These are the situations that not only refugees and asylum seekers find, but many groups of recent migrants also experience. And this is the context in which the new argument being made by the government, we have to be suspicious of these people, not to make them feel at home at all, but to worry about them, that they might not integrate, they might not learn English well enough, they might commit crimes, they might go and commit terrorist acts. These are all the things that we need to worry about. Actually, I got a little carried away with Hannah Arendt in preparing this, and she has quite a funny kind of section. She writes about a so-called Mr. Cohn from Berlin, who's a Jewish refugee. Until 1933, he was 150% German patriot. Yeah? He had to be 150%, not 100%, because he was Jewish. He had to prove that he was a patriot in a way that other Germans didn't have to prove the same thing. And when he flees there, he goes to Prague, he becomes a convinced Czech patriot, then he flees there, goes to Vienna, becomes an Austrian patriot, goes there and comes to Paris and becomes a French patriot. So the demand in all of these interventions by people like Dutton, by Turnbull, by Morrison, by Tudge, by the government generally, is actually not for multiculturalism. The demand here is for assimilation rapidly, and assimilation to 150% to prove your loyalty to the country. That's what you have to be. So what has this got to do with refugees? Well, I think these broader questions of dealing with multiculturalism, maybe trying to tap potential racist and xenophobic opposition to multiculturalism or to migration. Refugees are central to this because in the minds of masses of people, they are the most visible element of migration. This is the way in which most migrants come to the country. And this is the image we have of the entry of refugees, in this case, into Europe. So, as the most visible symbol of immigration, attacking refugees has an impact on what people think about migrants and immigration much more broadly than the question of refugees. So there are differences and there are arguments about what Australians actually think about immigration. This was one poll done by Essential in 2016 that said that 59% of Australians thought that immigration was too high. And 57% disagreed that Australia should increase its intake of refugees due to the refugee crisis in Europe. Now, some people argue that that's too high, and in fact, probably a more reliable study is by the Australian Electoral Survey, which is done every federal election. This was the 2016 result, which showed about 42% thought that it was too high. So that doesn't sound too much, but I'll tell you why that's a really significant figure in a moment. European attitudes to immigration have been more and more concerned about migrants, and particularly about refugees, for quite some time. Even before 2015, when around about 1 million people made their way into Europe seeking asylum. Even before that, concern about immigration was rising steadily, as you can see, from about 2012 in pretty much every country. And in fact, this is a really revealing graph, I think, because this is not a graph of people who are asked the question, do you think immigration is too high? This is a graph of people who are asked, what's the most important issue for you in your lives? So in, for example, Germany, this one, something like, was it over 45% of people thought immigration is the most important issue. Now, for people who study these things, political scientists who look at these polls over time, this is very unusual. Almost always, when people are asked the most important issues in their lives, it's the bread and butter ones. It's questions about jobs, it's questions about wages, housing, healthcare, education, etc. And certainly when you look at elections and people want to know those questions because political parties want to try to deal with those questions primarily, it's almost always those issues that come up the top. So when immigration goes up the top, something's happening when it rises to such a high level. And even though you might think, well, 45% of people thinking it's the most important issue, that means maybe 55% don't think it's the most important issue. But the important point here is that it's not symmetrical. The polarisation on the issue, that is, the people who want to lower immigration, are not agitating around the question in the same way as the people who want to keep it the same. For the people who want to keep it the same, generally it's not an issue. And therefore they don't agitate about it. They don't go out in demonstrations about it. They probably don't change their vote about it if they think immigration is about right. It's the people who want major reductions in immigration. They're the ones who are particularly head up about the question. And this is a point made by a political scientist at the Uni of Manchester. Too many words in that slide, but I'll put the slides up when we have a website again. I'll put them up on the website or put them up on Facebook or something. But the important point here is that there is a polarisation taking place, and the polarisation which is anti-immigration, anti-multicultural, anti-refugees is more fervent than the people on the other side. And this is not primarily an economic question. There is an element of economics in it, of people thinking there are too many people here already, not enough jobs, or housing prices too high. There's an element of that. And undoubtedly, the appeal to people to cut immigration, keep refugees out and so on, has an economic component. But it's primarily, I think, about identity. And you can see that when you look at who people think should come and shouldn't come. And it's quite marked. So allow many up here, so 20%, as long as they're the same race or ethnic group as you. And interestingly, in this one, it's not, there is anti-Semitism still. This is Europe. Yep. There is still, and I'll show you some graphs later on that illustrate that even more dramatically, the level of anti-Semitism in some countries in Europe. But then you get different races and ethnic groups, the numbers allowing many, etc., goes down and so on, until Muslims and Gypsies, Roma people, fare worst in all of that. I think this poll is also done in 2014, so it's before the large influx of people into Europe from Syria and North Africa, and I suspect the anti-Muslim sentiment since then would be much higher. So it's opposition to immigration here. You might think our immigration program is too large, who knows, for all sorts of reasons. Some people have environmental reasons for thinking that, etc., etc. But the primary reasons, most people think that's the case, and the primary agitation against immigration is because of identity, race, ethnicity, and religion. Now, it's probably against those people who think that there shouldn't be too many migrants. Migrants are bad for the country. Too many migrants of a different race or ethnicity, bad for the country. It's probably not much point in arguing narrow facts. But I'm going to here anyway, because I think this is a different audience, obviously. The fact is that Europe in particular needs migrants, has to have migrants. There's a very good demographer here, Peter MacDonald, here at the ANU, world-famous demographer. He writes that to keep a stable population under normal conditions, that is without war or famine or mass immigration or whatever, to keep a stable population, the same number, you've got to have a total fertility rate of 2.1 children per woman. Yeah? That just keeps it stable over a long period of time. Europe's overall fertility rate is 1.5, which means that the European population will decline without significant immigration. And in some places, Italy, for example, it's 1.3, which means a very rapid decline. And it's not just that the population will decline on a kind of a straight line going down, it will be an exponential decline because it will curve downwards more sharply. Because what happens is as the population does decline, it also gets older. And if you have an older population, then you have fewer people of childbearing age. So it goes down for a period and then the decline gets sharper, with the result that just to maintain in absolute numbers the current workforce of Europe, the European Union, 28 countries, EU 28, will need an annual intake of more than 1.5 million immigrants right up to 2050. That's just to keep the workforce as it is at the moment in Europe. Now, when you think about that, that's actually significantly more than the inflow of people who came in 2015 and 2016 to Europe. So what are we worried about? Actually, Europe needs it, absolutely needs it. There is also an important thing about the ageing of the population in that as the population gets older, there are fewer people of working age between 18 to 65 compared to those over 65. And it's generally thought that the age dependency ratio, it's called, needs to be about 3 to 1. So 3 people of working age to 1 over 65 in order to be sustainable, to maintain services, healthcare, all of those things, maybe pensions, etc. To maintain a 3 to 1 old age dependency ratio, the European will need more than 1.5 million. It will need an annual intake of about 3 million immigrants every year between now and 2050. Now, to give you an example, and this is the worst case scenario, is Italy. Italy's got the lowest fertility rate. And Italy, its dependency ratio is at the moment, that is, the percentage of those over 65 compared to the working population is 26%. By 2045, without mass immigration, 70% of the Italian population will be over 65. It's absolutely inconceivable that that can happen or be allowed to happen. And in order to prevent it happening, and to keep the population stable and the age dependency ratio at 3 to 1, Italy will have to take more than 35 million migrants by 2050, and Germany will have to take 40 million migrants. Again, Peter MacDonald worked out that if Italy doesn't do that, its population by the end of the century will be 8 million. Tiny. So, who should come in immigration is also obviously reflected very strongly in Australian attitudes as well. The figures here can be a bit dodgy, and the best, but also the most frightening poll I think we saw was an essential poll done in September 2016, which had a 49% figure of people opposing all Muslim immigration. So this is not necessarily people who oppose migration in general, but they want all Muslim immigration banned. And it spreads. Once you start to worry about the ethnic composition of the population or the religious composition of the population, it's not going to stay with one ethnicity or with one religion. And so here we have, again, this is 2016, and I think probably the figures for Muslims, negative opinions about Muslims in Europe would have gone up significantly since then. But even so, when you look at it, these are huge proportions of people in most of these countries who have negative opinions about these ethnicities. Now again, you can think, well, that's not too bad. I mean, 42% of Swedes, or 35% of, is it? Yeah, 35% of Swedes have negative opinions of Muslims. Well, you think that maybe means 65% don't. But the 35% are extremely agitated about it. The 65% think it's not an issue to have Muslims in the country. And so it's a question of mobilising those who think it's not an issue to think we've got to fight about this issue. Similarly, if you want to measure, I guess, multiculturalism, one cipher for it might be diversity. And what we find is that in a whole series now of European countries, diversity people don't like. They actually want monocultural societies, or growing minorities of people are moving against multiculturalism. Now, I want to just talk about a couple of sort of case studies in here, and if I'm running out of time I might cut it a bit shorter and not do them all, but Germany was right at the centre of this. A large proportion of the people who came into Europe in 2015 and 2016 were looking to head to Germany. And actually Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, was one of the better European leaders, without a doubt, in terms of accepting those people. But what we've seen in Germany, although Merkel is back in the last elections, survived as Chancellor, partly because of the way the party system works, it's also the case that the very far right Alternative for Germany won a huge advance, 12.8% of the vote. It's now the third largest party in Germany. And the AfD is, whether you call it an actual fascist party or not, I'm not sure, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close to being a fascist party. It wants to see no Muslims in Germany. It wants to send them back. It wants an end to multiculturalism. It's the pure race kind of argument. It's opposed, of course, to homosexuality and so on. Now, part of the thing that's happened here is that in the aftermath, or even in the latter stages of that influx of people coming into Germany, some of the centre politicians, including Merkel, actually shifted and gave ground to these arguments. So Merkel, for example, who'd always been opposed to a ban on the burqa, shifted her position at her party, the Christian Democratic Union's conference, in late 2016, and voted for a ban on the burqa. The conference voted, although Merkel didn't agree with this, to abolish dual citizenship. And she also made it clear that what had happened in 2015 and 2016 wasn't going to happen again, that there was going to be an arrangement with Turkey and so on to make sure that the same thing wouldn't happen. To a certain extent, what this did was to concede some ground to the right, and the right built on it, and the AFD built on it and was stunningly successful. Poland is one of the most extraordinary sets of circumstances. My partner is half Polish, and my daughter's about to visit Poland, so we'll find out all about it. But Poland has taken just about the toughest position. It's refused to take any refugees whatsoever. The EU tried to get a sharing arrangement, and Poland refused to do it. And as I said before, it's talking about setting up special camps in order to put those people who do get into Poland without a visa. And here are some quotes. I won't read them all. One of them, the Chief of the Prime Minister's Cabinet, is, "A good Christian is someone who helps, not necessarily by accepting refugees." And this fellow, Jaroslaw Kaczynski, is the effective leader of Poland. He's the leader of the ruling Law and Justice Party. During the 15-16 influx of people, he said that migrants carry all sorts of parasites and protozoa. Could be dangerous to us, not to them over there, but could be dangerous to us. We'd have to completely change our culture. And also, one of the features of the far right in Europe in responding to the refugee crisis and using Islamophobia, one of the features of it has been a sudden discovery of the importance of protecting the rights of women. All of a sudden, the key question about Muslims and keeping refugees out and so on is to protect Polish women from the Muslims and from people of different ethnicities. And Kaczynski says this, the wave of aggression, especially towards women on the part of asylum seekers. This was a magazine cover, not at all subtle, is it? This says, Islam raping Europe. And that's the official party. That's the party of government in Poland that's saying all that. Now, what's that done? Has that undermined, therefore, the movement elsewhere in Poland or other groups in Poland who might have even more racist arguments, who might be even nastier? It's done the opposite. It's actually created the culture in which they've grown very rapidly. Last November, there was, this is actually a video, but I won't play it. Last November, there was the biggest, probably close to fascist demonstration anywhere in Europe since the Second World War. People are saying it's the biggest since the war. 60,000 people marched in Warsaw, calling for pure blood, calling for the expulsion of Muslims, etc., etc. This, obviously, Stop Islamicisation. This reads, God, family and country. These are the kinds of slogans on which this new movement is built. And it's big and it's powerful. And it's being given air by the official government. And what's the proportion of Poland which is Muslim? I put this in because is it the case that Poles living alongside Muslims are finding the experience dangerous, harsh, that Muslims are attacking women in Poland or anything like that? Well, not unless they're doing it frenetically 24 hours a day, because less than 0.1% of the population of Poland is Muslim. So these ideas are independent of the facts on the ground, independent of the reality on the ground. Hungary is the other really horrifying case. It's also refused to accept a single refugee. And in fact, Viktor Orban, who's just actually last Sunday won a landslide victory in a campaign dominated by anti-refugee politics and by keeping non-Hungarians out of the country generally, but particularly refugees and particularly Muslims. Landslide victory. It's his third term, and he built a fence on Hungary's southern border, and the world was pretty horrified by that fence. We shouldn't be, because our fence has been going for quite a long time now, except it's constructed by the Australian Navy, mostly. And he said, we don't see these people as Muslim refugees, we see them as Muslim invaders, and multiculturalism is only an illusion. So this is nasty, nasty politics. Anti-migrant, anti-refugee, anti-multicultural, anti-Muslim. But this is the official party of government for 3 terms now. Has it sucked the wind, taken the wind out of the sails of even further right parties? On the contrary, what's happened is that the even further right in Hungary has grown. So an organisation called Jobbik, which is, again, I would say pretty much a fascist party. It's extremely anti-Semitic. It believes that Zionists are trying to take over Hungary. It's anti-gay, etc., etc. It wants to put gays in jail. It won around 20% of the vote and is now the 2nd largest party in Hungary. There they are in their uniforms marching. And here are some of the quotes from their leader, who just resigned actually after the election because he expected to win. And he came 2nd instead and resigned. But here are some of the quotes from him. You see, openly anti-Semitic in everything, but also clearly anti-Muslim. And Austria. Austria is the other pretty horrifying party in that it's now got in the Freedom Party again, probably the closest thing to a fascist party in coalition government in Europe today. Sebastian Kurz from the centre-right party, a right-wing party, but he's now allied with the Freedom Party. So the Freedom Party is in government now. And again, actually, it's one of its leaders talked about creating camps for refugees, and he used the term that had been used in German for concentration camps, and it was roundly criticised. Okay, I'm going to wind up with some general points. The first thing, I think, is that what that shows us very clearly is that the refugee has become the focal point of nationalist, anti-immigrant, anti-multicultural, and certainly anti-Islamic politics. The refugee is central to it. And what that means is that what we're fighting about is not just as important as it is, the rights of those people who are refugees. What we're fighting about is really we are the resistance to all of those politics as well. Secondly, the rise of the right is based in many factors. It's not just because of immigration. The reason that people flock to such parties is a complex of things. Precarious economic conditions, all sorts of things, less security in jobs, and so on. Many, many things. Expectations of life not fulfilled, and so on. And it's different in different sections of the population and in different countries. But immigration and refugee politics has become central to it in every country where the right has arisen. And it's not related to the number of migrants, refugees or Muslims actually in the country. It's not related to the reality on the ground at all. Let me show you that. So what we have here, all of these countries, and Hungary and Poland always come at the top of opposition to refugees, to migration, to Muslims. They always come at the top of polling in saying that refugees create crime, etc., etc. Yep. And similarly, there and here as well, Poland, Hungary, not followed too far behind with Austria. And they're all countries actually where the government have taken that position. The existing governments have taken that position. So of course, they're going to have the highest levels of opposition to Muslims and refugees and migrants. And here is, I mentioned it before, didn't I? But here is Hungary, with only 0.4% of its population Muslims, Poland with less than 0.1%. Slovakia and Czechoslovakia Czech Republic have also had really nasty policies towards refugees, and they've got tiny numbers of Muslims in their population. So these are the fantasies. They're fantasies which aren't based on the reality on the ground. They're not based on seeing Muslims committing crime. They're not based on not having jobs because there are Muslims there. But they are still central to the politics of it. Fourthly, taking this tough stand on refugees, as Fraser and Morrison and Dutton argue, does not encourage support for a migration program in general or for multiculturalism. And indeed, the fact that they've taken such a tough stand has legitimised opposition to immigration, opened up space for an argument against migration, and certainly opened up space for an argument against multiculturalism. Tony Abbott, ever the opportunist, looking for a way back into politics, has noticed this and now is arguing for a major cut to immigration. It's nothing to do with an economic argument. He's not looking at what economic demand will be created by the numbers of people coming in or anything like that. What he's looking to is to exploit ground that has already been prepared by the existing government, and particularly over the question of refugees. And that's been the case everywhere in Europe as well, where ground has been ceded on this question, on the question of refugees. Other, even nastier political formations have grown. Oh, that should be a 5, but anyway, there is an alternative to all of this. It's an alternative that we've argued for long and hard, and increase the number of people that we take, obviously. Process people in transit countries. Don't send them to Papua New Guinea and Nauru, but process them in the places that they get to as the countries that they first flee to, whether it be Malaysia or whether it be Indonesia, or in the case of Europe, in Turkey or in Libya or whatever, and then bring them safely, as we used to do. As we used to do during the 1970s and the 1980s. And then we can negotiate with other countries about taking large numbers of refugees. We certainly can't do it now. I really recommend a book called Asylum by Boat, written by Claire Higgins, who's agreed to come and speak at a public meeting for us later in the year. It's a really interesting book. She's an historian who's done a detailed study of the records, including public service records and so on, during the Fraser period, and that Indo-Chinese refugee crisis, 1976 to 1983. And one of the most fascinating things I found about the book is that she's gone back and she's looked at public service briefing papers, and public servants list a number of options that they don't necessarily support. But amongst the options listed for Fraser to consider and for the department to consider were detention centres, were maybe setting up somewhere not in Australia to send these people, maybe turning back the boats. Every single one of them was rejected. And in some cases, there are handwritten notes by the department heads saying this would wreck Australia's international reputation. This would be harmful to these people. This would destroy their sanity. We can't possibly do this. They were all rejected. Wouldn't it be great if we did have an Australian solution that was like that, and that we could put to the rest of the world rather than the one that's being proffered right now? And finally, while a lot of what I've said, particularly about Europe, is bleak, you know, the rise in many cases of the far right, actually, in terms of people mobilising and fighting, there is huge resistance to this. It's got to get bigger, but there's huge resistance. In fact, I mentioned the 60,000 fascist demonstration in Poland. There have been many demonstrations around that size opposing racism, opposing Islamophobia, supporting refugees. This is, down here is little Denmark. 30,000 people rallied outside the Danish parliament to welcome the refugees while the government was imposing more restrictions on them. So there are people who are prepared to fight. And those people include us. We are the resistance to all of this. Even if we don't succeed in the short term in changing this terrible policy, we still have to be the resistance. We still have to fight. Thanks very much.